Special Counsel Robert Mueller recently delivered his report showing that there was no evidence that the Trump campaign colluded with Russia. The question remains, though, if there was no evidence, how was this investigation launched in the first place? And to discuss this, we have with us today Marc Ruskin. He spent 27 years in the FBI. He's a former assistant district attorney in New York. He's also an adjunct professor at the John Jay School of Criminal Justice. So, Marc, we're glad to have you with us. And,
well, thanks for inviting me, Josh. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great. And so, Marc, I know that you were a field agent, which has a very different culture from the leadership of the FBI. And so when people talk about corruption in the FBI, from what I understand, a lot of guys on the ground say, yes, yes, there is corruption, and you guys don't like it, from what I get.
Unfortunately, one has to have the perspective and realize that the FBI historically has been an independent and objective national police force, responsible in large part for preserving our democracy by remaining free of political influence. And for agents, for field agents, to see that reputation sullied by individuals who have allowed themselves to be influenced by political considerations is very upsetting to both the rank-and-file FBI agents and to retired FBI agents. The kind of corruption that we've seen, the politicization of the Bureau, is something which has happened only at the highest levels, only at the very upper echelon in the executive suite at FBI headquarters. It's not something which affects FBI agents in the normal course of their investigations, and the overwhelming majority of FBI agents would not knowingly participate in a politicized investigation. But here you have a situation where the very upper management, the ones who are unregulated, I'll point out the FBI has something called the Inspection Division. And what the Inspection Division does, it's a kind of internal auditing and compliance that inspects all the field divisions of the FBI and inspects the different power sources, centers, divisions within FBI headquarters, except for one. There's one that does not get inspected, and that's the director's office and those surrounding the director. And therein lies the opportunity for foul play.
I see. In your own analysis, how was it that this whole investigation into Trump-Russia collusion started if there was no evidence of collusion to justify it? How did that happen? Any
investigation is initiated with what's referred to as a preliminary inquiry. So if allegations are made in the normal course of business for the FBI, there is a limited inquiry authorized by Department of Justice practices, which allows FBI agents to at least see if there are sufficient credible allegations to pursue an investigation. So what should have happened, allegations were made. These allegations are always being made about all sorts of things. The FBI has an obligation to at least do a preliminary review to see if they're credible and warrant further investigation. So in this case, there were sufficient allegations made to warrant the initial inquiry. However, what's dubious is whether or not there was sufficient credible evidence to then go further and conduct a full-blown investigation, which as was done prior to the election when the Obama White House initiated its investigation into the Trump campaign.
Well, it seems that at least one of the pieces that we know happened was that former British spy Christopher Steele was hired by Fusion GPS, which was working as an opposition research company for the Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee. They created the Steele dossier. The Steele dossier was then spread through different branches of the government, given to different journalists, given to different public officials, given to different federal agencies. I think McCain personally delivered it.
Yeah, and perhaps what's worse, I mean, here you have a document based in large part on open source information available on the internet, which had virtually unverified and virtually unsubstantiated allegations. It was by circulating enough times, it assumed a credibility which was undeserved, and in particular because individuals supposedly of high stature vouched for it. In particular, I would suggest that the former CIA director Roberts is really at fault for lending credibility, for having it attached to an intelligence report, which was a legitimate intelligence report, but by cohabitating together, so the credibility of the intelligence report, let's say, kind of overflowed onto this document that everyone is calling a dossier instead of a file. But so it was a kind of a Brennan very significantly contributed for no underlying purpose that can be articulated other than political animosity, which he holds for the president. And that then started the snowball to roll. And like any other snowball, as it rolls, it gathers momentum and becomes larger and larger until it hits a tree, like the Mueller Report.
Yeah, well, you know, I think what it seems like also happened, there's two things. One is that a lot of the people who were directly briefed on it seemed to have known what the source was. That this was a politicized document by someone doing opposition research. The FBI was working with Christopher Steele also, and you know, stopped working with him because he was talking to media, which you can't do. From what I understand, if you're an FBI source.
Right. Ordinarily, an FBI source is supposed to follow FBI policy having to do with confidential informants, and leaking documents and talking to the media is generally not a favorable practice.
But despite this, the FBI did go forward with the investigation, which seems to have been based heavily on the information Steele spread. It's not. I think one of the questions we should have still is, how aware were the individuals spreading this rumor that the other people they were hearing it from were looking at the same source of information? Was there other information being spread that the public was never told about? And also, was this being done intentionally? And I think the last part, the intentionally part, is going to be one of the big pieces that is going to be in the public debate in the coming months. What's your take on this?
What's needed is a thorough and objective investigation. To date, certainly from the congressional side, investigation has been political in nature and motivated not necessarily by a search for fact, but rather by seeking opportunities to make political points. The new FBI Director Wray, hopefully, and Attorney General Barr, who has an impeccable reputation, and Michael Horowitz, the Department of Justice Inspector General, all three have to take now the bull by the horns and investigate this thoroughly so that we can find out who knew how unsubstantiated it was and when, and then whether or not there's an underlying criminal cases to be made here. I think there seems to be a good argument to be made that the White House under Obama was influential in pushing for this investigation. But that's speculation on my part, but it may bear out to be in fact true. We'll only find out once all the people who knew what was going on have testified under oath, either to investigators or other responsible officials.
Now, you mentioned one of the issues the FBI has is that there's two different cultures. There's the overall FBI and the field agents and all this, then there's a leadership. And you also mentioned that the one part of the FBI that's not really properly inspected is the leadership. We're in an interesting state now where I think most of that leadership organization has been fired or removed because of their involvement in this or related scandals, I guess we could say. What is your understanding of why that had to happen, or do you think that had to happen, that they were removed over this and kind of related issues?
Well, piecemeal, as information has come out about the acts of different upper-level managers, they have either been fired or probably, pushed to resign or to retire, depending on whether they were eligible to retire. It's important to emphasize that we're only talking about the executive suite here. It's true there is within the FBI essentially two cultures. There's the field agent culture, who are the men and women who are actually going out into the field, into the street, into the jungle sometimes all over the world, risking their lives in order to make this country safer. And then there's the management culture, who are the individuals. Some of them are very good managers, and others are people who just didn't function well on the street and preferred working at an office or behind a desk. And some of those who have climbed to the top tend to be the more ruthless and better infighters. I think Andrew McCabe would fall into that category, and probably Peter Strzok as well. These were people who had rapid career rises, in part because they were seeking power and aggressively advancing their own personal interests to assume power. Many individuals who do that are have a long view and are looking down the road to when they retire, and having had a high-level position, seek six-figure or seven-figure income retirement jobs afterwards. But anyway, circling back to why they left, initially, Comey deservedly, I would suggest, it's my conclusion based on what I've observed, was fired by the president. And his testimony shortly afterwards substantiated the president's actions. In particular, shocking to me and to the vast majority of field agents, and probably to a great number of management agents, was the leaking of documents that he testified to before Congress. That was really shocking, because if a regular agent were to release documents to the press, FBI official documents, and all FBI official documents are sensitive by the nature of being FBI documents. To release a document, one needs authorization, even if one is the director. So to have released documents and then done it surreptitiously by passing them to a friend who's a professor with the view that they be passed to the media is at the very least a violation of FBI policy, and perhaps a criminal activity as well. So for the director of the FBI to have engaged in that sort of behavior and then attempted to deflate it by releasing it himself in testimony, knowing that were it to be found, and eventually would be found out, that the consequences could be significant, this gave him the opportunity to minimize the actions that he had taken, and then to fabricate a reason. The reason he provided was that he was hoping that a special counsel would be appointed. Now, that's a pretty far-fetched reason to say, I'm going to leak documents in order that perhaps someone will then come up with the idea of appointing a special counsel. It stretches credulity.
Right.
I would suggest that that was a made-up reason, perhaps by his attorneys afterwards, to justify the act that he had taken.
The whole thing was interesting because, at least from what we understand on the surface, Rod Rosenstein, I believe it was, recommended that Trump, or was it Sessions? I think it was Rod Rosenstein, recommended that Trump fire James Comey.
Right.
And then James Comey comes out and says, this was obstruction, even though it was a recommendation. And at that time, too, people have to remember that Democrats and Republicans, both sides, didn't like James Comey. The Democrats didn't like him because right before the elections, he came out and renewed the investigation into Hillary.
Right, that's right.
And they got really unhappy about that. But when Trump fires Comey, suddenly Comey's a hero of the Democrats, which they didn't like him before that.
He's a curious figure in that, due perhaps to his hubris, he has managed to offend both the right and the left. He offended, I shouldn't say the right, but maybe the center-right. He offended Republicans by his treatment of the Hillary server investigation, and we can go into that if you wish. The manner in which
where he changed the lange of the charges, which I believe it was. Speaking as an attorney, if one commits acts with reckless disregard, that was the key word, reckless disregard.
That
changed.
That is sufficient intent to justify a criminal charge. So there's different kinds of intent. There's specific intent when you think I'm going to do this, and you intend to do it. But there's also intent understood to arise from acting in reckless disregard of the obvious consequences of your actions. You know, if you drink a bottle of whiskey and get in a car and run over someone and kill them, you're acting in reckless disregard of the life of others, even though you didn't intend to kill that person had you been sober. So the original conclusion being that Hillary Clinton acted in reckless disregard of the law when she set up her email server and then had top secret classified emails publicly accessible to any intelligence service in the world. And then the language was changed to extreme carelessness.
And it was Comey, we believe, who changed that.
Right, which perhaps under pressure from the White House or from Loretta Lynch, the Attorney General. Now, the other thing that was very curious was Comey's announcement that he made as director of the FBI that charges would not be pursued against Hillary Clinton. It's not the director of the FBI's job to make a decision as to whether or not criminal charges are going to be brought against someone or they're not going to be brought against someone. That's the job of the Attorney General and the Department of Justice. The FBI's job is to gather all the evidence, put it together in a nice package, and then turn it over to justice. And they decide, or they have a grand jury impaneled to decide whether or not to bring criminal charges. So for Comey to make the announcement was highly irregular and really surprised and shocked a lot of field agents. The theory that most seem to have in the media and in politics is that he did it because of hubris and because of his own sense of grandeur, self-aggrandizement. My opinion is that he did it under pressure from the White House. That seems to me the most logical scenario, is that Loretta Lynch's credibility had been destroyed essentially by her meeting with Clinton on the tarmac there in the plains. So had Loretta Lynch, who would be the normal person to make the announcement, made the announcement, it wouldn't have been accepted by the general public as legitimate. So my suspicion is the White House then said, hey, Jim, we want you to bite the bullet. You make the announcement because you still have credibility with the public. You're the director of the FBI. Everyone thinks the FBI has a lot of integrity. And that he caved and did it. That's my belief.
It's interesting. I could see that. And that brings up an interesting point, too, though, because with Robert Mueller now, the special counsel, when he passed his evidence, when he passed his information right over to the FBI and they made their determination on, well, from what I understand, the FBI doesn't make the determination normally. And the same thing works with the special counsel. Special counsel hands over the evidence they've collected. They're not the one that makes the determination on whether there's something criminal happened. A lot of people are wondering whether, say, the information Robert Mueller passed over did have something in it, but that the new appointees didn't recognize that. What would you say to that?
Well, first I'll point out what Mueller prepared is a prosecutor's report. Mueller is a prosecutor. He's not a judge. His job is not to exonerate or not exonerate any individual. That's the job of a judge and a jury. The prosecutor looks at the facts and looks at them in the way most negative to the person being investigated. So if Mueller could not bring charges, concluded that no charges could be brought against Trump, then I believe we can say with certainty that there was nothing there to charge Trump with. I'll point out that with regard to the statements made by John Roberts, I mean, he was making statements essentially indicating that there was evidence of collusion by Trump, but the statements were conclusory. They were never based on articulated facts that he had uncovered or that he was aware of. He was just stating his conclusions, as were Schiff and all the others. But now we have a report from Mueller with showing that there's no articulable facts to support such a charge. Now, and additionally, one hears a lot of comment that, well, we still need to investigate Trump for obstruction of justice, that perhaps Mueller could not find or could not articulate a basis for a collusion charge, but there's still obstruction of justice. The failure, logically, with that stream of thought is that you cannot have obstruction of justice unless you have an underlying crime that's being obstructed.
It's an interesting point.
So
how could you obstruct justice if there was no injustice?
Right, you have to commit a crime and then obstruct investigation of that crime. But if the prosecutor, in this case Mueller, after a very thorough investigation, and he was lauded by the Democrats up and down as having great integrity, and there was great fear expressed from the Democrats that Trump was going to fire Mueller, and had he tried to fire Mueller, it would be a constitutional crisis. Well, Mueller was not fired by Trump. He reached his conclusion in his own good time and found no articulable facts. So for now to argue, well, maybe there's obstruction, again, you can't obstruct a crime that didn't happen. So you have to have a foundation. The foundation is the crime, and then the obstruction is trying to conceal that crime. If you don't have a foundation, you can't build. You can't build a building without a foundation. So logically, it's just impossible and doesn't make sense.
Another thing too is that people talk about the scope of the Mueller investigation. Of course, we don't know yet what the scope was, but we can look at the other people who were charged and the kinds of crimes they were charged for, which had nothing to do with Russia or anything. They were old financial crimes. So we can assume that Mueller was looking into finances, Mueller was looking into everything he could find, and charged people very far from Trump with crimes that were in no way related to the original nature of the investigation.
Right. Either they were unrelated, as in the case of Paul Manafort, where there were white-collar economic crimes, which, unfortunately for him, he was associated with Trump. Otherwise, he probably could have gone on for the rest of his life before anyone encountered any financial crimes. But being involved in politics cost him something. And many individuals, I mean, there were hundreds of people who were interviewed, and as you're pointing out, none were charged with any crimes which were related to the underlying scope of the investigation. There's a big call now also for release of the entire Mueller report. And one thing that I'd like to point out in relation to that is with the Watergate report, the special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, didn't cause that report to not be released for 50 years. Just recently were the details. And in part, the reason was to not besmirch the reputation of individuals who were interviewed but not charged. So the same thing would apply here now. Mueller and his team interviewed hundreds of people. For their names and their information to be made public, where they have no effective means of countering any claims or allegations, would really besmirch and be a real injustice to those people.
And this ties into something else, which is the nature of, say, raw investigations. That when you're dealing with investigations, these are not criminal, proven facts a lot of times. A lot of times it's claims of random witnesses. They might be lying. Some of the information might not have been properly checked. And if they're making allegations or accusations against different people, and they don't have the I doubt a lot of media would give them the proper platform to refute the claims, then yeah, I could see that being a pretty big problem.
Right. I mean, much of what was going to be in the report is essentially going to be raw data. And like you say, just interviews from individuals whose information may or may not be substantiated or corroborated.
Now, I think we're at an interesting time as well, where a lot of Americans, especially on the conservative side, I think no longer have faith in the, say, integrity of the federal agencies, especially FBI and CIA. And part of this is they believe that there's a double standard. They believe that there's the rules for thee and not for me kind of way of doing things. We saw this recently with the whole Justin Smollett case and, you know, being let off with no charges and so on. What do you think needs to be done to restore public faith in, say, law enforcement and federal law enforcement?
Well, federal law enforcement in particular, because that's what I can speak to, based on my experience as a special agent, has to be free of political influence. You need a strong director and an independent agency that is free to investigate in any direction and in whatever the political stripes are that are being worn by the individual being investigated. I mean, my experience in public corruption investigations, which was extensive, we investigated corruption both within the Republican Party and within the Democrat. And that's one thing I have to say, sad as it may seem, that no particular ideology or side or political coloring seems to have a monopoly on corruption. I mean, you have corrupt officials on both sides of the aisle and at both ends of the spectrum. So the agency has to be able to investigate criminal activity regardless of who. And if the public perceives that these investigations are being conducted objectively, so in this particular case now, then if the public perceive that there are consequences for those who lied or deliberately obfuscated, then that would go a long way to bringing back a feeling of respect for the independence of the FBI. As much as Hoover was criticized for abusing power, no one ever rationally accused Hoover of being subject to political influence. No one could be, Hoover never took phone calls from the White House or from Congress telling him who to prosecute or who not to, or who to investigate or who not to investigate.
What was the significance of Hoover with this? Just some people don't know the
just because he helped establish, despite some perhaps excesses in abuse of power at times, the FBI as an independent agency. They could not be bought and they could not be influenced. And that is how our democratic institutions can be protected, is if the officials, be they in the judiciary, be they in the executive, be they in Congress, know that if they commit illegal acts, the FBI will come after them. That preserves our democratic system. On the other hand, if they believe, as may have happened in recent times, that the FBI can be influenced, that the hound dogs can be called off based on political ideology or based on political influence.
Or called on.
called on, then we're no longer, then we're becoming a banana republic or an Orwellian type of state, not the United States of America that the founders sought to create.
And I guess the last question, which is, so we had a almost 2-year investigation, which ended in showing that basically it was launched with no evidence. One of the big questions is what is the ideology of? Is there a shared ideology of the people behind this? What was it in their heads that made them do this? That there were so many individuals, most it seems were on the left, on the Democrat side, who all pulled this whole thing together and really brought the whole nation into chaos and tarnished the image of our president around the world and among Americans.
Here, and I appreciate the question, and it calls for an opinion, basically, because I can't provide any more than my personal speculation. And there were many. You're right; it was mostly from the left, but there were some from the right,
like
in
McCain,
particular,
for example,
McCain, or I think of Bill Kristol in particular as being, especially arrogant and obnoxious in his commentaries. But here we have someone who ran for president, ran in the primary, who was a complete outsider. He was not part of the Beltway inside club. He was not someone with a political background. And it seems that the reaction to an outsider coming in and being successful in the primary was stunning to so many people.
And we should remember that even the Republicans weren't sure whether they would let him run under the Republican kind of brand. He almost had to run as an indendent.
Right, but at the end they had no choice. I mean, he won the primary. He was the Republican debates essentially were like a circular firing squad, and then they all destroyed each other and spent so much time attacking each other. None of them believed that there was a remote possibility that Trump could win, so they didn't focus on him. Then lo and behold, they wake up and he's now the candidate, and then lo and behold, later on, he's actually the President of the United States. And just a very great many Democrats and Republicans, for them, he's an anathema. And then the fact that he's kept his promises and has fulfilled acts such as moving the United States Embassy to Jerusalem.
He's talking about draining the swamp, which I'm sure some of them might see that as a threat.
Right, it's a threat to their economic security and to their ability to help their friends in high financial places and so forth. So I think that there's a lot of shock and resentment bred this and fed into this investigation, and now the reaction of many to try and ignore the results is curious indeed. So I think the last act has yet to play out, and we'll still have some interesting times ahead of us.
Great, Marc. Thanks for coming.
No, thank you.
Appreciate
Thanks, Josh,
me.
for inviting me.
Great, thank you.